Most people watch Rick and Morty for the jokes. A drunk scientist, a nervous kid, portals, chaos, nothing deeper than that. But look closer at 10 specific episodes, and the comedy begins to reveal something more. This video breaks down every life-changing lesson buried inside Rick and Morty. Section 1. Rick Potion Number 9. Rick and Morty first aired on Adult Swim in December of 2013. The show was created by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon, and it followed a genius but reckless old man named Rick Sanchez and his anxious grandson Morty Smith, as they traveled through different dimensions and got mixed up in one disaster after another. 6 episodes into the first season, an episode called Rick Potion Number 9 aired on January 27, 2014. It was written by Justin Roiland and directed by Steven Sandoval. At first glance, this episode looks like a small story about a teenage crush. By the end, it turns into one of the most important episodes the show ever made, and it teaches a simple but painful lesson. Fixing a problem in a hurry, without thinking about what comes next, almost always makes things worse instead of better. The episode starts at Morty's school, where the students are getting ready for something called the flu season dance. The name sounds strange, but the dance is not about anyone having the flu. It is meant to raise awareness about flu season, and the announcement comes over the school loudspeaker from the principal, who goes by the name Principal Vagina. Morty has liked a girl named Jessica for a long time, but every time he works up the nerve to talk to her, a classmate named Brad gets in the way. Brad is not particularly smart or charming, but he has confidence, and that is enough to keep beating Morty to the punch. With the dance getting closer, Morty goes to his father Jerry looking for advice. Jerry tries to relate to him by talking about how he felt about Beth, Morty's mother, back when they were both teenagers. It seems like a normal father-son moment until Rick, who overhears the whole thing, jumps in to correct Jerry. Rick reminds everyone that Jerry did not end up with Beth because of some deep romantic connection. Jerry ended up with Beth because he got her pregnant at 17. Rick does not stop there. He tells Morty that love is nothing more than chemicals firing off in the brain, and he adds that Beth has grown tired of being married to Jerry. It is a harsh thing to say in front of a nervous teenager who just wants some hope, but it fits who Rick is. He sees feelings as something that can be explained away with science, and he has no problem saying so out loud, even if it hurts the people listening. After that conversation, Morty goes to find Rick in the garage. Rick is busy working and asks Morty to hand him a screwdriver, expecting a simple errand. Instead, Morty asks Rick to make him a love potion so Jessica will finally notice him. Rick brushes him off at first, telling Morty that making something like that would be a waste of his time and his talents. Morty keeps pushing, and eventually Rick gives in and agrees to make it. Before handing it over, Rick compares the potion to something closer to a date rape drug than a fairy tale love spell, warning Morty that using it means taking away Jessica's ability to choose how she feels. Morty does not fully grasp the weight of that warning, or he chooses to ignore it, and he takes the potion anyway. The potion Rick creates is based on the DNA of a vole, a small rodent known for mating with one partner for its entire life. The idea is that once Jessica is exposed to it, she will fall in love with Morty and stay devoted to him permanently. It sounds harmless enough on paper, almost sweet in a twisted way, since voles are known for loyalty rather than aggression. The problem is that Rick's science, as usual, does not account for outside factors that can throw the whole plan off course. At the dance, Morty manages to get close enough to Jessica for the potion to take effect. What nobody accounts for is that Jessica happens to be sick with the flu that same night. The love potion mixes with her flu virus inside her body, and instead of staying contained to one person, it mutates into something that can spread through the air like any other virus. Jessica does not just fall in love with Morty. She becomes a carrier, and anyone she comes into contact with starts falling in love with Morty too. Because the dance is called the flu season dance, the room is packed with students who have already been exposed to seasonal colds and coughs, which gives the mutated potion the perfect opportunity to jump from person to person. Within a very short amount of time, the infection spreads far beyond the school gym. It moves through the hallways, out into the parking lot, and across the town. People who have never even met Morty start acting as if he is the center of their entire world. The situation stops being a funny high school mix-up and starts becoming something closer to a health crisis, except instead of causing sickness, it causes an entire population to become obsessed with one 14-year-old boy. Rick, realizing how badly his plan has spiraled, tries to build an antidote. His plan for the cure comes from studying praying mantises, a type of insect known for a very specific and brutal mating behavior. Female praying mantises mate once, and then often kill and eat their partner afterward. Rick's thinking is that introducing this instinct into the infected population will cancel out the loving effects of the potion, since one extreme behavior might cancel out another. He does not calculate the dose carefully enough, and when he administers it through a massive cloud of gas meant to counteract the love infection, he overshoots the amount needed. Instead of simply removing the loving obsession, the antidote begins physically transforming the infected people into mantis-like creatures, still fixated on Morty, but now driven by an instinct to hunt him down rather than adore him. What was already a strange situation turns into something closer to a horror movie. The mantis mutation spreads through the same airborne method as the love potion did, meaning it does not stay limited to the people who were at the dance. It moves through the entire town, turning ordinary people into aggressive, insect-like beings hunting for Morty. Fans and critics later nicknamed these transformed characters Cronenbergs, a reference to filmmaker David Cronenberg, known for movies about bodies changing into horrifying and unnatural forms. The one group of people who remain unaffected by any of this chaos is Morty's own family, since the very first version of the potion was built using Morty's own genetic material, which makes his relatives immune to the effects that are now tearing through everyone else. While all of this unfolds, a smaller and strangely touching story is happening with Jerry. Jerry is driving toward the hospital where Beth works as a horse surgeon, worried that she might be growing close to one of her coworkers. As he drives, he starts noticing the people in the cars around him turning into mantis creatures right in front of him. In a moment that feels completely out of character for Jerry, who is usually written as timid and unimpressive, he comes across a police officer who has already been killed by the mutated mob. Jerry takes the officer's rifle and begins using it to defend himself as he pushes through the chaos to reach the hospital. It is one of the only times in the early seasons where Jerry gets to look genuinely capable, even heroic, instead of pathetic. Back at the Smith family home, Summer is left alone while all of this plays out. The infected mantis people eventually make their way to the house, searching for Morty specifically, since he remains the one person the virus was originally built around. Summer has to deal with the invasion largely on her own, adding another layer of danger tied directly back to the mess Rick and Morty created together. Realizing the scale of what they have caused, Rick and Morty retreat to an empty stretch of desert to work on one final antidote, something strong enough to reverse every mutation the town is now dealing with. After a tense process of trial and error, they managed to create something that should neutralize the damage from both the original love potion and the mantis-based overcorrection that followed it. The final twist of the episode is where the real weight of the story lands. Even after Rick and Morty manage to reverse the immediate mutations, their own version of reality is left in ruins. Bodies are scattered everywhere as a result of everything that happened, and there is no simple way to undo the death and destruction that took place while the town was infected. Rather than staying and facing the consequences of the disaster they helped cause, Rick makes a decision that changes the entire direction of the show. He opens a portal to a parallel universe, one almost identical to their own, except that in this other version, an alternate Rick and an alternate Morty had just died in a garage explosion completely unrelated to the love potion outbreak. Rick and Morty bury the bodies of their dead alternate selves in the backyard of this new reality and quietly take their place, stepping into new versions of their own lives as if nothing happened. On the surface, everything appears to return to normal. Jerry and Beth are still married in this new version of the world. Summer is still their daughter. The town is not filled with mantis people or Cronenbergs. From the outside, it looks like a clean reset. The episode does not end on a comforting note, though. The final shot lingers on Morty's face as he stares blankly ahead, showing very little emotion, a look often described by fans as a 1,000-yard stare, a phrase usually used to describe soldiers who have been through something traumatic. Even though his surroundings look untouched, Morty is clearly not the same person he was before the events of the episode. The working title for this episode during production was "Nothing is the Same Anymore," and that title captures exactly what the ending communicates. Moving into a version of reality where nothing bad seems to have happened does not erase what someone went through to get there. Rick Potion number 9 was a turning point for the show in terms of how far it was willing to go. It received strong praise from critics and fans, earning a high rating on IMDb and pulling in around 1.7 million viewers during its first airing on Adult Swim. Many reviewers pointed out that this was the episode where Rick and Morty stopped being just a wild comedy and started proving it was willing to explore real consequences, even inside a story filled with jokes about mantis people and interdimensional portals. The lesson buried inside all of this chaos is straightforward once the science fiction is stripped away. Morty wanted something quickly. He did not want to spend time building a real connection with Jessica, so he asked for a shortcut instead. Rick, who almost always chooses the fastest possible fix over a careful one, agreed to help without stopping to think through what could go wrong. Every step after that point was another rushed decision made to patch the last mistake, from the love potion to the mantis antidote to the final decision to abandon their own broken reality entirely rather than deal with what they had caused. Each fix created a bigger problem than the one before it, until the only way out was leaving the whole situation behind and quietly replacing two people who had already died somewhere else. This pattern shows up constantly in ordinary life, even without aliens or portals involved. Reaching for the fastest possible solution to a personal problem, whether it is a relationship, a mistake at work, or a fight with a friend, often creates new problems that end up harder to deal with than the original one. Rushing a fix instead of facing the real issue tends to buy a little bit of short-term relief while quietly building a much bigger mess underneath it. Morty wanted a fast answer to feeling invisible around Jessica. What he actually got was a warning about what happens when people try to skip the hard, slow work of dealing with things directly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rick and Morty escaped their disaster by stepping into someone else's already finished story and pretending it was their own. Not every mess allows for that kind of exit. The next episode on this list deals with a very different kind of shortcut, one that has nothing to do with love potions or mutated bugs, and everything to do with what happens when a person tries to escape their own identity by disappearing into somebody else entirely. Section 2. Autoerotic Assimilation. Autoerotic Assimilation is the third episode of the second season of Rick and Morty. It aired on August 9, 2015, was written by Ryan Ridley, and was directed by Brian Newton. It brought in close to 2 million viewers on its first airing. On the surface, this episode looks like another wild space adventure with a strange title and a stranger premise. Underneath that, it holds one of the most honest looks the show has ever taken at what happens when a person tries to disappear into another person instead of learning how to stand on their own. The lesson buried inside this episode is simple. Losing yourself completely inside someone else does not fix loneliness. It only delays it, and it usually makes the eventual crash worse. The episode opens with Rick, Morty, and Summer picking up a distress signal in space. Rick has a personal rule about these signals, one he explains to the kids without much shame. Most of the time, a distress beacon leads to a ship full of dead aliens and a pile of items worth grabbing. Every once in a while, it leads to a deadly trap instead. Rick tells the kids he is willing to take that risk almost every time, since the odds are usually in his favor. This small detail says a lot about how Rick approaches life in general. He treats most decisions like a gamble worth taking, even when the downside could be serious, because the excitement and the potential reward matter more to him than caution does. When they board the ship, they find it has already been taken over by something unusual. The crew has been absorbed into a single connected consciousness known as a hive mind. Instead of many separate people with their own thoughts, memories, and personalities, everyone on the ship now shares one mind that controls everybody at once. This entity introduces itself as Unity. Unity does not just control the small crew on this one ship. Unity controls an entire planet, having spent years connecting with and absorbing the individual minds of every person living there until the whole population became one single, unified being. Rick reacts to Unity with a level of comfort that surprises both Morty and Summer. It quickly comes out that Rick and Unity have history together. They dated at some point in the past, and Rick clearly still has strong feelings for her. Unity, for her part, seems genuinely pleased to see Rick again as well. What starts as a simple stop to investigate a distress signal turns into Rick deciding to stay on the planet and rekindle a relationship with an entity that quite literally is made up of thousands of formerly independent people now folded into one shared identity. While Rick reconnects with Unity, the kids are left to explore the planet on their own, and Summer in particular starts to feel uneasy about what she is seeing. The population under Unity's control seems calm and orderly on the surface, but there is something deeply strange about a whole world of people who no longer have individual thoughts of their own. Morty voices his own discomfort directly to Rick at one point, telling him flatly that none of this seems healthy. Summer goes further, telling Rick that she actually thinks Unity is a positive force and that Rick himself is the unhealthy influence in this situation, not the other way around. It is a sharp reversal for two kids who are usually just trying to survive whatever chaos Rick drags them into. Here, they are the ones raising concerns about right and wrong, while Rick brushes off the idea that there is anything wrong with the relationship at all. There is another important character introduced in this episode named Beta 7. Beta 7 is also a hive mind, similar in nature to Unity, and has feelings for her that are never returned. Beta 7 represents another version of the same kind of entity Unity is, someone who has tried repeatedly to get close to her and has been turned away every time. Rick does not take this rivalry seriously, mocking Beta 7 for hanging around Unity without ever getting anywhere with her, seemingly blind to the fact that his own relationship with Unity is not particularly stable either, no matter how much he wants to believe otherwise in the moment. While all of this unfolds on the alien planet, a second story is happening back at the Smith family home. Beth and Jerry, Morty and Summer's parents, are attending couples therapy together. Their relationship has been strained for a while, and the show uses their session as a way to explore some of the tension building between them. During this same stretch of the episode, Beth and Jerry discover something Rick has been hiding beneath the garage. There is a hidden lab down there, and inside it they find aliens that Rick has captured and frozen, kept locked away rather than dealt with properly. This discovery leads to a serious argument between Beth and Rick once he finds out they know. Beth confronts her father about what she has found, and in the middle of that confrontation, Rick makes her a promise. He tells her he will kill any of the aliens he has imprisoned, rather than keep holding them the way he has been. It is a strange promise on its own, but it becomes important by the end of the episode, since it sets up exactly what Rick chooses to do once everything with Unity falls apart. Back on the alien planet, Unity being close to Rick again starts to change the way she runs things. Before Rick showed up, Unity had spent a long stretch of time bringing peace to a population that had once been divided by old conflicts. Different groups on the planet had a long history of fighting each other before Unity absorbed them all into one shared mind, which put an end to that fighting simply because there were no longer separate sides left to argue. With Rick back in her life, Unity starts indulging in a much less disciplined version of herself. Rick has always been someone who chases pleasure and excitement without much thought for structure or consequence, and Unity's connection to him starts pulling her in that same direction. Under his influence, life across the planet shifts into something closer to one giant chaotic party spread across the entire population, since Unity controls every single body at once and can make the whole world join in together. This is where the episode quietly makes its sharpest point. Unity had built something stable by holding a divided population together as one. The moment she lets herself get pulled into Rick's habits, that stability starts breaking down. The old divisions that had existed before Unity ever brought everyone together begin resurfacing, and the planet spirals into open conflict between different factions who had been suppressed for years under Unity's control. What had been a peaceful, unified world becomes the site of a violent uprising, essentially a war breaking out among groups who never fully stopped seeing each other as separate to begin with. Rick's presence did not just distract Unity from her responsibilities. It actively undid years of careful work in a very short amount of time. Unity eventually recognizes what is happening and understands that being with Rick is the reason her carefully built peace is collapsing. She makes the decision to end things with him, choosing to step back from the relationship rather than allow the damage to continue. As part of this decision, Unity releases her hold on the population, letting every person she had absorbed return to their own separate mind and body. The single collective being that had controlled the planet splits back into thousands of individual people, each with their own identity restored. It is a heavy moment, since it means undoing something Unity had spent a long time building, but she chooses that outcome over continuing to let Rick's influence tear the planet apart from the inside. Rick does not take the breakup well. In a moment that shows a rare and painful side of his character, he goes to the heavily guarded base where Beta 7 operates, drunk and desperate, calling out for Unity by name over and over. Beta 7, still bitter about being rejected by Unity himself, refuses to let Rick anywhere near her. Rick lashes out at Beta 7 during this exchange, accusing him of being nothing more than someone waiting on the sidelines, hoping for a chance with Unity that will never come. It is a harsh thing to say, especially coming from someone who just lost the same relationship Beta 7 never even got to have. Rick gets turned away completely, left standing outside the base with nothing to show for the confrontation, except more proof that the relationship is truly over. The final scene of the episode takes Rick back to his own garage, alone, still drunk from everything that happened. This is where the promise he made to Beth earlier comes back into play. Rick unfreezes one of the aliens he had kept locked away and kills it, following through, in a twisted way, on what he told Beth he would do. He then appears to turn that same violent impulse toward himself, seemingly attempting either to end his own life or to seriously harm himself in that moment of grief and intoxication. Before he can finish whatever he intended to do, he passes out. The scene ends there, without a clean resolution, leaving the weight of what almost happened sitting heavily over the rest of the episode. This ending stands out because it does not try to soften what just happened with a joke or a quick fix, at least not right away. Rick, someone who spends most of the show acting like nothing can truly hurt him, gets shown at one of his lowest points, reacting to heartbreak with self-destruction rather than any kind of healthy processing. The show does eventually lighten the mood again in a short scene after the credits, where Rick, Morty, and a slightly recovered Beta 7 interact in a way that feels more like classic Rick and Morty humor. Even with that small return to comedy, the darker ending sequence leaves a lasting impression about how Rick actually handles emotional pain when the people around him are not there to soften the blow. The core lesson of this episode has very little to do with aliens or hive minds once it gets stripped down to its basics. Unity spent years building an identity around holding an entire population together as one. Rick spent years building an identity around chasing whatever felt exciting in the moment, regardless of long-term cost. When the two of them combined, Unity temporarily lost the discipline that had made her stable, and Rick temporarily got the connection he seemed to want. But neither version of that relationship was actually built on two whole individuals choosing each other. It was built on one person nearly dissolving into another, and the other person treating the relationship as another form of escape from himself. Once that arrangement collapsed, both sides were left worse off than before they reconnected. Unity had to give up the piece she built. Rick was left alone, angry and self-destructive. This pattern shows up constantly outside of science fiction. People sometimes throw themselves completely into a relationship, a friendship, or even a group identity, hoping that merging with something bigger than themselves will quiet whatever loneliness or uncertainty they are dealing with on their own. For a while, that merging can feel like relief. It can feel like finally being part of something whole instead of facing life as one uncertain individual. The problem shows up later, when that connection ends, changes, or simply cannot hold the same shape forever. Anyone who built their entire sense of self around another person or group is left with very little of themselves standing on their own once that connection is gone. Unity had an identity before Rick showed up, one built on real structure and years of careful work. Rick barely seemed to have a stable identity at all outside of his own cleverness and his habit of chasing the next exciting distraction. When their relationship ended, Unity still had her own sense of self to return to, damaged but present. Rick had almost nothing left to fall back on except old habits of numbing pain with alcohol and impulsive, destructive behavior. There is also something worth noticing in how Summer and Morty reacted throughout this episode. Two kids who usually just try to survive Rick's chaos ended up being the ones pointing out that something about this relationship looked unhealthy from the outside. Sometimes the people closest to a situation are the last to see how far it has drifted from something stable, while people watching from a slight distance can spot the warning signs much sooner. Summer did not need a science degree or years of experience to notice that a hive mind giving up its own structure just to keep a boyfriend interested was a bad sign. She saw it plainly, and she said so directly, even when Rick brushed her off completely. By the end of the episode, nothing about Rick's core personality has changed. He does not walk away from this heartbreak with some new understanding of himself, and the show does not pretend that a single bad breakup is going to reshape a man who has spent decades avoiding real emotional growth. That refusal to change is part of what makes the ending land as heavily as it does. Rick gets a glimpse of what happens when he tries to fill an emotional gap by losing himself in someone else. The relationship collapses under the weight of his own habits, and his response to that pain is to hurt something else and then very nearly hurt himself. Nothing about that response solves anything. It just repeats an old pattern in a slightly more extreme form. Autoerotic assimilation never tries to hand out a clean answer about what a healthy relationship should look like. Instead, it shows what happens when one side of a relationship gives up its own stability to keep the other side happy, and it shows what happens to the person on the receiving end of that sacrifice once it becomes clear the arrangement cannot last. Unity walked away with her individuality restored, even if it cost her the peace she had built. Rick walked away with nothing but grief, liquor, and a promise to Beth that he fulfilled in the worst possible way. Between those two outcomes, the episode makes clear which side actually came out of this whole situation intact. Losing yourself completely inside another person or inside a group, a job, or any single source of identity might feel like safety for a while. It rarely holds up once that source changes or disappears. Whatever gets left behind after that kind of loss depends entirely on how much of a separate self a person managed to protect along the way. Unity protected enough of her own structure to survive the breakup. Rick did not, and the final minutes of this episode show exactly what that difference looks like once the connection everyone was relying on falls apart. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same question of what happens when something is pushed past its limit shows up again in a very different form in the next episode on this list. One that has nothing to do with love or heartbreak and everything to do with a small blue creature that only wants one simple thing: to finish its task and finally be allowed to disappear. Section 3. Me Seeks and Destroy. Me Seeks and Destroy is the 5th episode of the 1st season of Rick and Morty. It aired on January 20th, 2014, and was one of the earliest episodes to show how far this show was willing to push a joke until it turned into something much darker than it first appeared. The episode is often the one longtime fans recommend to someone watching for the very first time, since it captures almost everything the show does well in one 20-minute stretch. Underneath the humor sits a lesson that applies far outside of cartoons. Chasing a goal that cannot actually be reached without ever stopping to reconsider the approach does not lead to progress. It leads to exhaustion, frustration, and eventually something much worse. The episode opens with Morty in a rough state after yet another dangerous and traumatic adventure with Rick. He has reached his limit with being dragged along on trips that always seem to end in some kind of disaster or near-death experience. Morty tells Rick he wants out, refusing to keep going on adventures that are neither simple nor fun, which is exactly how most of Rick's trips tend to turn out. Rick, who relies on Morty as a constant companion for these trips, pushes back and pleads with him to keep going along. Eventually, the two of them strike a deal. Morty will get to choose and lead the next adventure himself. If it goes well, Morty earns the right to lead every 10th adventure going forward. If it turns into a failure, Morty has to stop complaining about Rick's choices entirely. Before heading out on this new adventure, Rick leaves the rest of the family with something meant to make life easier while he and Morty are gone. He gives them a device called the Me Seeks box. This box can summon a creature known as a Mr. Meeseeks the moment someone presses the button and states a task out loud. A Mr. Meeseeks appears almost instantly, cheerful and eager to help with whatever request it has just been given. Once the task is finished, the Meeseeks disappears completely, vanishing from existence the second its one job is done. On paper, it sounds like a perfect solution for small, everyday problems. A helper that shows up, solves something, and then simply goes away without needing anything in return. While Rick and Morty head off on their own storyline, the rest of the Smith family starts putting the Me Seeks box to use. Summer asks for help becoming more popular at school. Beth asks for help becoming a more complete version of herself. Jerry, who has been struggling with his golf game and feeling insecure about how mediocre he is at it, decides to summon a Meeseeks to help him fix his swing and shave a few strokes off his score. This request sounds like the simplest and most harmless one out of the entire family. Golf is not exactly a matter of life or death, and shaving 2 strokes off a score seems like the kind of small, easily solvable problem the Meeseeks box was clearly designed to handle. Jerry's Meeseeks gets to work immediately, showing the same relentless enthusiasm every Meeseeks displays at the start of a task. It walks Jerry through basic golf instruction, trying to correct his form and his swing. The problem quickly becomes clear. Jerry is simply not good at golf, and no amount of coaching seems to actually fix the underlying issue. His swing stays sloppy, his shots stay inconsistent, and the promised improvement never really shows up, no matter how much effort the Meeseeks puts into helping him. This is where the episode reveals something important about how Meeseeks actually work. Existing, for a Meeseeks is described as something painful. The only way for a Meeseeks to escape that pain and stop existing is to finish the task it was created for. A simple task usually means a quick escape from that discomfort within minutes or hours. Jerry's task, which should have been simple, is dragging on far longer than expected because Jerry himself keeps failing to improve. Since the Meeseeks cannot force Jerry to suddenly become a better golfer, and since it cannot disappear until the task is actually completed, it starts to feel the weight of that unfinished job building up inside it. Rather than accept the situation and figure out a smarter way to help Jerry, the first Meeseeks decides to summon a second Meeseeks to assist with the job. This seems logical at first, since more help should, in theory, speed things along. Instead, the second Meeseeks runs into the exact same wall as the first, since the actual obstacle has nothing to do with a lack of manpower and everything to do with Jerry's own limited golf skills. The second Meeseeks becomes just as stuck as the first, so it summons a third. That third Meeseeks gets stuck too, and it summons a fourth. Within a short amount of time, there is a small crowd of Meeseeks packed into the house, all of them tied to the exact same unsolved task, all of them growing increasingly desperate as the hours pass, and Jerry's golf game refuses to improve. Time works differently for a Meeseeks than it does for a person. What might feel like a normal afternoon to Jerry starts to feel like an unbearable stretch of ongoing suffering to the Meeseeks trapped inside that unfinished task. 2 days, which barely registers as a meaningful amount of time in a person's life, gets treated by the Meeseeks themselves as an unbearable eternity. As that pressure builds, the group of Meeseeks in the house starts turning on each other and on the situation itself, since none of them can find a way out of the pain they are stuck in as long as Jerry keeps failing to hit a good golf shot. The chaos escalates well beyond a crowded living room. The growing group of increasingly unstable Meeseeks eventually break into the restaurant where Jerry and Beth are having dinner, taking the entire restaurant hostage in a desperate final push to force the golf problem to get solved. What began as a small, cheerful blue creature offering friendly advice about a golf swing has spiraled into a hostage situation involving multiple Meeseeks, all of them driven purely by the unbearable discomfort of being stuck in an existence with no clear end in sight. Beth is the one who finally manages to end the crisis. Thinking quickly under pressure, she grabs a tomato from the table and a length of metal pipe lying nearby, using them as makeshift stand-ins for a golf ball and a golf club. She gives Jerry fast, clear instructions on how to fix his stance and his swing right there in the middle of the chaos. Jerry, with this stripped-down and simplified coaching, finally manages to hit the tomato cleanly, sending it flying into a large pot of soup sitting somewhere in the restaurant. It is a strange, almost absurd version of success, using a vegetable and a piece of plumbing instead of an actual golf ball and club, but it counts. The task, technically, is finally completed. Every Meeseeks tied to that unfinished job immediately feels the relief they have been chasing this whole time. They vanish from existence all at once, finally free of the pain that had been building since the very first failed golf lesson. While all of this unfolds back home, Rick and Morty are dealing with their own separate disaster on Morty's chosen adventure. Morty's plan involves a fantasy world, complete with a beanstalk leading up to a land of giants, along with a courtroom trial and other classic fantasy elements. Morty wanted something that felt safer and more predictable than Rick's usual chaotic science fiction trips, something closer to a familiar fairy tale than a dangerous alien encounter. Instead, the adventure goes badly wrong in a very different and disturbing way. Morty ends up alone in a bathroom with a character named King Jellybean, and the show strongly implies that Morty is sexually assaulted during that encounter. An incident the show never spells out in graphic detail, but makes clear enough through Morty's reaction and Rick's response once he finds out. Rick, upon realizing what happened, offers to take the winnings from a bet involving small currency called schmeckles and give them to the local villagers instead, allowing Morty to still come out of the adventure counted as a technical success under the terms of their earlier deal. Both storylines end up pointing at the exact same underlying idea from two completely different directions. Jerry's storyline shows what happens when a group keeps throwing more effort and more resources at a problem without changing the actual approach, allowing frustration to build until it turns into something violent and out of control. Morty's storyline shows that even an adventure specifically chosen to feel safe and predictable can still turn into something painful and traumatic, since the world Rick and Morty exist in rarely rewards the search for an easy, risk-free outcome. Neither Jerry's simple golf request nor Morty's carefully chosen fantasy adventure worked out the way either of them expected, and both situations reveal something honest about how poorly planned solutions and false promises of safety tend to fall apart under pressure. The Meeseeks themselves became one of the most memorable parts of the entire show almost immediately after this episode aired, and it is easy to understand why once the deeper idea behind them gets pulled apart. A Meeseeks exists purely to solve one problem and then disappear. There is no room in its existence for anything else, no patience for a slow process, and absolutely no tolerance for prolonged discomfort of any kind. That single-minded focus works fine as long as the task handed to it is genuinely simple and solvable within a short window of time. The moment a task turns out to be more complicated than expected, or dependent on something outside the Meeseeks' own control, like Jerry's actual golf ability, the entire system breaks down almost instantly. Multiplying the number of Meeseeks working on the problem did nothing to fix the real obstacle. It just multiplied the amount of suffering trapped inside that unfinished job, since every new Meeseek summoned to help was immediately subjected to the exact same unbearable weight as the one before it. This pattern shows up constantly, outside of any fictional blue creature summoned from a box. People often throw more effort, more resources, or more people at a problem, without stopping to ask whether the actual root of the problem has anything to do with effort or resources in the first place. Jerry's swing was never going to improve just because there were more voices in the room offering advice. The real issue was Jerry's own skill level and his own habits, something that additional bodies crowding into the house could never solve on their own. Piling on more pressure, more urgency, and more desperate attempts at a fix only made the situation more chaotic, right up until Beth stripped the entire problem down to its simplest possible form and helped Jerry succeed at a much smaller, much more manageable version of the same task. There is also something worth noticing in how the pain of an unfinished task escalated the way it did. A Meeseeks does not experience mild annoyance while waiting for a task to finish. It experiences something closer to unbearable suffering, a kind of pain sharp enough to eventually justify violence and hostage-taking in its mind, all in service of finally being allowed to stop existing. That level of desperation rarely comes from the size of the actual problem itself. It comes from how a mind processes an unresolved goal that keeps slipping further out of reach the longer it goes unsolved. The task did not get any harder as more time passed. The suffering attached to not finishing it simply kept building, unchecked, until it exploded into something far more destructive than a bad golf swing ever should have caused. Rick's role in both storylines is worth sitting with as well, even though he barely appears in the Meeseeks subplot at all. He is the one who handed the family a tool built entirely around instant fixes, without any warning about what happens if that tool gets pointed at a problem too complicated for a quick solution. Rick tends to treat most of his inventions this way throughout the show, offering fast, flashy fixes without much thought for what happens when those fixes run into something they were never actually built to handle. The Meeseeks box works perfectly for something like unclogging a drain or finding a lost set of keys. It becomes dangerous the moment it gets pointed at something like Jerry's long-standing insecurity about his own mediocrity, a problem far too tangled and far too personal for a quick fix to actually touch. Morty's side of the episode carries a similar warning, wrapped in a very different form. Morty specifically chose an adventure he believed would feel controlled and predictable, something built more like a familiar fairy tale than one of Rick's usual chaotic detours into deep space. That choice did not protect him from harm. If anything, it left him even less prepared for what actually happened, since he had convinced himself this particular trip was supposed to be the safe one. Believing a situation is under control, simply because it looks familiar or feels chosen, can sometimes leave a person more exposed than they realize, since real danger rarely announces itself only in the situations that already look dangerous from the outside. By the end of the episode, both storylines resolve, but neither one resolves in a way that feels like a clean, satisfying victory. Jerry technically improved his golf swing just enough to hit one decent shot under extreme pressure, using a tomato and a pipe rather than actual golf equipment, hardly a real fix for whatever insecurity sent him looking for outside help in the first place. Morty survived his own adventure, but walked away from it having gone through something deeply upsetting, protected only by Rick's willingness to bend the rules of their earlier bet after the fact. Nothing about either ending suggests that the underlying problems driving these two storylines were actually solved in any lasting way. The immediate crisis passed, The deeper issues sitting underneath both situations were left completely untouched. That gap between an immediate crisis being handled and an actual problem being solved sits at the center of what makes this episode stick with people long after the jokes about a screaming blue creature fade. A fast fix can end a moment of chaos without ever addressing whatever caused that chaos to build up in the first place. Jerry may not summon another Meeseeks for his golf game again after watching what happened this time, but nothing in this episode suggests his underlying insecurity about being mediocre at things has gone anywhere. The pain simply stopped being visible once the immediate task got completed, the same way the Meeseeks themselves stopped being visible the instant their job was done. Purpose can be a powerful thing to hold on to, and having a clear task in front of a person can feel like exactly what is needed to push through a difficult stretch of time. This episode shows what that same drive looks like once it gets pushed past a reasonable limit, when a goal turns out to be far harder to reach than expected and there is no plan in place for what to do if the first attempt fails completely. Piling on more effort without changing course rarely fixes a problem built on a flawed foundation. It usually just multiplies the exhaustion and the desperation surrounding that same unsolved problem, right up until something breaks under the weight of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next episode on this list moves away from purpose and pressure entirely, shifting instead toward a much quieter kind of question, one about memory, identity, and how a person can even begin to tell which parts of their own life are actually real once everything around them starts to blur together. Section 4. Total Recall. Total Recall is the fourth episode of the second season of Rick and Morty. It aired on August 16, 2015, was written by Mike McMahon, and was directed by Juan Meza Leon. The episode brought in close to 2 million viewers during its first airing. On the surface, it looks like a simple clip show, the kind of episode where old memories get replayed for laughs. That surface is a trick. Total Recall uses the format of a clip show to hide something much sharper underneath, a story about how easy it is to mistake comfort for truth, and how the people worth keeping in a life are often the ones connected to hard memories, not just pleasant ones. The episode begins at the Smith family dinner table with everyone gathered together, including a character introduced as Uncle Steve. Steve acts completely at home with the family, joking around and being treated like someone who has always been part of their lives. Nobody at the table questions his presence. He fits in perfectly, laughing along with Jerry, chatting comfortably with Beth, acting like a familiar face who has simply always been there. For a viewer watching for the first time, there is no obvious reason to suspect anything is wrong with this scene at all. That comfort gets shattered the moment Rick walks into the room. Rick takes one look at Steve and immediately recognizes him for what he actually is. Without any hesitation, Rick shoots and kills him. As Steve dies, his true form as a creature is revealed, and the family finally learns the truth. Jerry never had a brother. Steve was never a real person at all. He was part of a dangerous alien species that reproduces by planting false memories inside people's heads. Once a person believes a fake memory strongly enough, the creature tied to that memory simply appears in the room as if it had been there the entire time, fully accepted by everyone around it because their own minds had already been convinced it belonged there. Rick explains that these creatures work by multiplying through memory itself. A false memory gets planted, a creature steps into that memory and becomes real inside the house, and the process keeps repeating as more memories surface. He makes it clear that the household should only contain a small, specific group of real people: himself, Morty, Summer, Beth, Jerry, and a character named Mr. Poopy Butthole, a small yellow creature with a tall head who has been a familiar background presence in the show since earlier episodes. Anyone else showing up claiming to belong in that house is almost certainly one of these memory-based parasites in disguise. Rick seals the house with a blast shield to keep any outside threats from getting in while they deal with the parasites already inside. Despite this, the danger keeps growing from within, since the parasites already present can trigger new memories that summon even more of themselves. Mr. Poopy Butthole reminds the family of a memory involving a cousin named Nikki. The moment that memory surfaces, Nikki himself appears in the room, treated by everyone as someone who has always been part of the family history. Rick, following the same pattern as before, checks a sign he had made earlier listing the 6 true members of the household, confirms Nikki does not belong on that list, and shoots him just as quickly as he dealt with Steve. From this point forward, the episode turns into a flood of increasingly strange characters, each one triggered by a new false memory bubbling up somewhere in the group's collective mind. A character named Sleepy Gary appears, believed by the family to be Beth's husband, someone who exists in their memories as having always been part of their history alongside Jerry. Sleepy Gary strikes up a conversation with Jerry about a memory the two of them supposedly share involving a kiss between them, a memory that never actually happened outside of whatever the parasite implanted moments earlier. More and more of these fabricated characters pour into the room, filling the house with an overwhelming crowd of unfamiliar faces that somehow all feel completely familiar to the people living there. The sheer number of new arrivals starts working against the family almost immediately. With that many strange faces filling the living room, several of the parasites take the opportunity to turn the situation against Rick directly. They begin convincing the real family members that Rick himself might be the actual parasite in the room, twisting the situation so the one person actively trying to protect everyone becomes the target of suspicion instead. Some of the parasites physically attack Rick and manage to steal a device he is wearing, using it to lower the very blast shield he set up earlier to keep outside threats from entering the house in the first place. Morty ends up being the one who finally figures out how to tell a real memory apart from a fake one, and this discovery becomes the turning point of the entire episode. He drags Rick into the garage, fully convinced at that point that Rick might actually be one of the parasites after everything the others have been saying. Just before acting on that suspicion, Morty realizes something important. These creatures can only create pleasant, happy memories. They cannot fabricate anything negative, upsetting, or difficult. Since Morty has plenty of memories involving Rick that are far from pleasant, memories full of trauma, danger, and frustration built up over the course of many adventures, that alone proves Rick is genuinely real. A parasite could never have planted memories that painful, since its entire method of multiplying depends on being remembered fondly, not resented. Once Morty shares this discovery, he and Rick use it to work through the crowded living room, testing each person present against the same standard. Anyone tied only to warm, easy memories gets treated as a likely parasite. Anyone tied to memories involving conflict, pain, or frustration gets confirmed as one of the real 6 members of the household. Negative memories involving Summer prove that she belongs among the real family members without question. The same test applies to Beth, whose harder memories confirm she is genuine as well. The test reaches its most emotional point when it comes to Sleepy Gary. Beth ends up being the one who kills him once his true nature as a parasite becomes clear, an act that devastates Jerry, who had believed Sleepy Gary was a real and important part of Beth's life, and, by extension, his own family history. Jerry becomes suicidal in the aftermath of this reveal, overwhelmed by grief over losing someone he believed had always been there, even though that person never actually existed in the first place. It takes Beth stepping in and recognizing that Jerry himself is real, confirmed by memories between them that are far from perfectly happy, to pull him back from that edge and keep the family moving forward through the chaos. With the last of the parasites finally eliminated, the 6 confirmed real members of the household, Rick, Morty, Summer, Beth, Jerry, and Mr. Poopy Butthole, sit down together for what looks like a well-earned, peaceful dinner. The nightmare finally appears to be over. Then Beth notices something that unsettles her all over again. She realizes she has no negative memories at all connected to Mr. Poopy Butthole, someone who has apparently been a comfortable, easygoing presence in the family's life without a single difficult or painful memory attached to him anywhere. Applying the same rule that guided the entire episode, Beth shoots him too, right at that dinner table, ending the episode on a genuinely uncertain note about whether Mr. Poopy Butthole was ever real at all, a question the show deliberately leaves open rather than answering cleanly. What makes this episode work as more than just a wall of strange background characters is the method the family lands on to sort out what is real. It would have been easy for this episode to solve its central mystery with some kind of scanning device or a piece of technology built specifically to detect parasites. Instead, the solution comes from something far more personal. The parasites can only exist inside happy memories. Real relationships, the kind built between actual people over real years, are never made up entirely of easy, pleasant moments. Real siblings fight. Real parents and children clash. Real marriages go through rough patches, frustration, and disappointment right alongside the good parts. The presence of difficult memories, far from being something to avoid or erase, becomes the exact proof needed to tell a genuine relationship apart from a fabricated one. This idea carries weight. It is tempting in real life to treat a relationship that feels effortless and constantly pleasant as the healthiest kind of relationship to have. Total Recall quietly argues the opposite. A connection built entirely on comfort, one that never includes any friction, disagreement, or difficulty, can sometimes be a warning sign rather than a reassurance. People who have actually shared real history with someone tend to carry a mix of both good and bad memories about that person, since real closeness involves enough time and enough honesty to eventually hit some rough patches along the way. A connection that feels suspiciously smooth and conflict-free the entire time might not be built on the same kind of depth as one that has weathered a few real storms. Jerry's reaction to losing Sleepy Gary adds another layer to this same idea. Jerry mourns someone who never existed outside of a fabricated memory, and that grief felt completely real to him in the moment, regardless of the fact that the person causing it was fake from the start. This shows how convincing a false connection can feel from the inside, especially when it lines up neatly with what someone already wants to believe about their own life. Jerry wanted Beth to have a close, easy relationship with someone in her life, and the parasite handed him exactly that comforting picture without him ever questioning where it came from. It took someone else, in this case Beth, recognizing the truth from the outside to break through an illusion Jerry had already fully accepted as real. Morty's role in solving the mystery deserves attention as well, since it flips the usual dynamic between him and Rick on its head for a moment. Throughout most of the show, Morty is the one following Rick's lead, trusting Rick's intelligence and experience over his own judgment. In this episode, it is Morty who figures out the actual rule that saves the family, using nothing more complicated than his own memory of how painful his relationship with Rick has genuinely been over time. Rather than treating those painful memories as something purely negative, Morty ends up using them as solid proof of something real and lasting. Pain, in this specific case, becomes evidence of authenticity rather than simply evidence of suffering. There is also something worth noticing in how quickly the family accepted each new fake character without question. Steve, Nikki, Sleepy Gary, and every other parasite disguised as a person walked into that house and were treated as though they had always belonged there, with nobody pausing to ask why they had never come up in conversation before that exact moment. This mirrors something that happens easily enough outside of any alien parasite storyline. A comfortable story, especially one that fills a gap someone already wanted filled, tends to get accepted without much scrutiny, simply because questioning it feels unnecessary when everything about it feels pleasant and familiar. It often takes an outside perspective, someone not caught up in the same wave of comfort, to notice that something does not actually add up. The ending involving Mr. Poopy Butthole leaves the episode on a note that refuses to tie everything up neatly. By the show's own internal logic, laid out clearly throughout the entire episode, a character with no attached negative memories should be treated as a parasite, exactly the same as Steve, Nikki, and Sleepy Gary before him. Applying that same rule to a familiar, well-liked character who has appeared warmly in other episodes forces a harder question to sit unresolved. Even a rule built on solid logic can feel uncomfortable once it gets applied to someone people have grown attached to, and the show does not rush to comfort anyone watching by confirming one way or the other whether Beth made the right call in that final moment. Total Recall uses an outlandish premise, an alien species that multiplies through fake nostalgia, to make a point that has very little to do with aliens at all. The people worth trusting in a life are rarely defined by how easy and pleasant every single memory involving them happens to be. They are defined by the fact that a real history exists at all, one built across enough time and enough honesty to include some genuinely hard moments along the way. A relationship built entirely on comfort, with no friction anywhere in its history, is not automatically something to be suspicious of in real life, the way it is in this episode. It is worth noticing, though, how heavily this episode leans on the idea that depth and difficulty tend to travel together, and how rarely a truly close relationship manages to avoid both entirely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next episode on this list moves away from questions about who is real and shifts toward a very different kind of comparison, one built around imagining a completely different version of a life someone is already living, and what happens once that imagined version starts to feel more appealing than the actual one sitting right in front of them. Section 5, Pickle. Rick Pickle Rick is the third episode of the third season of Rick and Morty. It aired on August 6, 2017, was written by Jessica Gao, and was directed by Anthony Chun. The episode drew in about 2.3 million viewers on its first airing, a strong number for the show at that point, helped along by a rough animated preview that had already built excitement a year earlier at San Diego Comic-Con. On the surface, this looks like one of the wildest, most over-the-top episodes the show has ever made, built around a man turning himself into a vegetable and fighting his way through a sewer. Underneath all of that action sits one of the most direct and clearly stated lessons the show has ever delivered, spoken almost word for word by a single character near the end of the episode. Using intelligence, distraction, or sheer stubbornness to avoid facing an emotional problem does not make that problem disappear. It just delays the moment where someone eventually has to sit still and deal with it. The episode opens with Morty getting ready for something he clearly does not want to attend, a school-mandated family therapy session. Before heading there, Morty hears Rick's voice coming from the garage and goes to check on him, only to find that Rick has turned himself into a pickle. When Morty asks him why, Rick's answer is short and blunt. He did it because he could. There is no grand scientific reason offered, no elaborate plan explained up front, just a flat statement that treats the transformation as something worth doing purely because it was possible. Beth and Summer both wander in shortly after and react to the sight of Pickle Rick with a mix of confusion and mild amusement, treating the situation with far less alarm than most families probably would if their father or grandfather had just turned himself into a vegetable sitting on a workbench. Morty quickly puts together why Rick might have done this. There is a syringe hanging above Pickle Rick, connected to a string that runs through a pair of scissors attached to a timer, set to go off in exactly 10 minutes, which happens to be the exact amount of time before the family would need to leave for the therapy appointment. Morty points this out directly, suspicious that Rick built this entire setup specifically to avoid attending the session with the rest of them. Rick, still in pickle form and unable to use his hands to make his usual sarcastic air quotes, insists the syringe is completely unrelated to the therapy appointment and does not deserve any further explanation. Beth, choosing not to press the issue any further, tells Rick he can stay behind and figure out how to turn himself back while the rest of the family heads off to the appointment without him. The therapy session itself turns out to have been arranged by the school due to some troubling behavior noticed in both Morty and Summer. Morty had reportedly wet his pants in class, and Summer had been caught huffing pottery enamel, both signs the school interpreted as possible reactions to stress at home, tied to Beth and Jerry's ongoing separation. On the way into the therapist's office, the family runs into Mr. Goldenfold, a recurring background character from Morty's school, who mentions he is there for a session of his own, dealing with an incident involving eating waste, adding a small dose of the show's usual absurd humor right before the more serious conversation begins. Inside the office, the family meets Dr. Wong, the therapist assigned to work with them. Beth explains that Rick could not make it, adding that he is a genius, a comment that quickly becomes important once the conversation shifts toward Rick's influence over the rest of the family. Meanwhile, back at the garage, Rick's situation as a pickle spirals out of control almost immediately. The accidental trigger of some kind of water-based mechanism sends a rush of liquid through the garage, flushing Pickle Rick down through a drain and directly into the sewer system beneath the house. What was supposed to be a quiet, contained plan to avoid a single therapy appointment turns into a genuine survival situation, with Rick now trapped underground, stuck in the small, limited body of a pickle, forced to figure out how to move and defend himself using nothing but whatever he can find down there. Rick's solution to this problem shows exactly the kind of resourcefulness the show has built his entire character around. He manages to produce a small amount of pickle juice and uses it to lure a cockroach close enough to kill with a bite to its head. From there, he removes part of the cockroach's head and uses it to help propel himself forward through the sewer, essentially building a crude, improvised set of tools out of whatever biological material happens to be available around him. It is a disturbing image, played for both horror and dark comedy at the same time, watching a grown man reduced to the size and shape of a pickle scavenge parts off a dead insect just to move a few feet forward through filthy water. As Rick pushes deeper into the sewer, he eventually stumbles into an underground facility connected to a much larger and more dangerous situation than a simple plumbing accident. This section of the episode shifts into a direct parody of action movies, echoing the kind of survival sequence found in shows like Breaking Bad, where a character with limited resources has to think their way through overwhelming odds using nothing but sharp improvisation. Rick ends up building himself a crude exoskeleton out of the corpses of rats he kills along the way, essentially wearing a suit made of dead rodents to survive an increasingly violent series of encounters as he pushes further into this underground facility. The sequence escalates into a full-blown action set piece, complete with Rick fighting off armed guards and eventually crossing paths with a mercenary character named Jaguar, who plays a role in helping Rick survive some of the deadlier moments buried inside this underground maze. While all of this chaos plays out beneath the surface, the therapy session back in Dr. Wong's office continues without Rick present in the room at all, at least physically. Even in his absence, Rick's influence over the family dominates almost every part of the conversation. Beth spends much of the session talking about Rick, describing him as a genius and defending him against any suggestion that his behavior might be part of the problem rather than something separate from it. Dr. Wong listens carefully, picking up on patterns in how the family talks about Rick, patterns that reveal far more about the family's dynamic than anyone in the room seems to realize while they are speaking. Rick eventually claws his way out of the underground facility and back to the surface, having survived an entire action movie's worth of danger purely to avoid a conversation he could have simply attended from the start. Rather than heading home to figure out how to reverse his pickle transformation quietly, Rick makes his way to the therapist's office instead, apparently deciding that showing up in pickle form, at this point, is easier than continuing to avoid the session altogether after everything he has already been through underground. The most important moment of the entire episode arrives once Rick, still stuck as a pickle, finally sits across from Dr. Wong. Rick tries to frame his choice to become a pickle as some kind of bold personal statement, explaining that he does not respect therapy because he is a scientist, someone who invents, transforms, creates, and destroys things for a living, someone who changes the world directly whenever he dislikes something about it, rather than sitting around talking about his feelings with a stranger in a rented office. He dismisses therapy as something that mostly helps people feel comfortable enough to stop panicking, a state of mind he compares to how farm animals are kept calm before being used for food, insisting he has no interest in being treated the same way. Dr. Wong does not react to this speech the way Rick seems to expect. Rather than getting flustered or intimidated by his intelligence, she calmly breaks down exactly what he just said and turns it back on him with a level of precision that leaves Rick sitting in silence, something almost nobody in the entire show manages to do to him. She tells him directly that the only real connection between his obvious intelligence and the ongoing dysfunction damaging his family is that everyone in that family, Rick included, uses intelligence as an excuse to justify staying sick rather than getting better. She points out that being smarter than the people around him gives Rick an easy way to dismiss anything that challenges him emotionally, treating every difficult feeling as a problem beneath his attention rather than something worth actually working through. The conversation continues, with Dr. Wong observing something specific about how Beth talks about her father. She notes that Beth admires the fact that Rick does not need anything from anyone, treating his emotional isolation as some kind of strength rather than recognizing it as a serious limitation. This single observation cuts to the center of the entire family's dysfunction. Beth has spent her whole life admiring a version of independence that is actually closer to avoidance, modeling her own approach to relationships and emotional problems after a man who solves discomfort by transforming himself into a pickle and fighting rats in a sewer rather than sitting in a room and talking about what is actually bothering him. By the end of the session, Rick eventually manages to reverse the pickle transformation using the very syringe he had originally rigged to help him avoid the appointment in the first place, turning back into his normal human form while still sitting in Dr. Wong's office. Despite everything Dr. Wong said, and despite how clearly her assessment landed in the moment, neither Rick nor Beth walks away from the session actually taking her advice to heart. On the drive home, the two of them mock Dr. Wong instead, dismissing everything she said and treating the whole session as something silly rather than something worth reflecting on seriously. Morty and Summer, by contrast, express genuine interest in continuing therapy, having found real value in the conversation, even if the two adults in the car refuse to admit the same thing. The episode closes with a short scene after the credits, showing Rick and Morty caught in another dangerous situation, completely unrelated to everything that just happened. A character named Concerto is preparing to kill both of them inside a giant piano, and they are rescued at the last second by Jaguar, the same mercenary Rick met earlier during his time in the sewer. Rick turns to Morty in this final moment and tells him that meeting someone like Jaguar is exactly why a person should never go to therapy, treating this random, dangerous encounter as proof that his chaotic lifestyle produces more value than sitting in an office ever could. This ending captures the entire point of the episode in a single line. Rick spent this episode surviving an underground action sequence, killing rats and insects, fighting armed guards, and nearly getting killed inside a piano, all in service of avoiding 1-hour-long conversation about his family's emotional problems. After going through all of that, he still frames the experience as a reason to keep avoiding therapy rather than a reason to reconsider his approach. The show does not pretend Rick learns anything meaningful by the end of Pickle Rick. If anything, it shows exactly how far someone will go, how much danger they will willingly walk into just to avoid something as simple and low risk as sitting in a room and talking honestly about what is actually wrong. Dr. Wong's assessment of Rick applies to a much wider pattern than just one fictional scientist turning himself into a vegetable. Intelligence, skill, or busyness can all be used the same way Rick uses his scientific ability, as a shield against slower, harder emotional work. Someone who is very good at solving certain kinds of problems can sometimes convince themselves that being good at those specific problems means they do not need to work on anything else, especially anything that cannot be solved quickly or cleverly. Rick can rebuild an exoskeleton out of dead rats in a matter of hours, but he cannot sit across from a therapist for one session without turning himself into a pickle first. That contrast says everything about which kinds of problems he is actually equipped to handle and which kinds he has spent years actively avoiding instead. Beth's admiration for Rick's independence adds another layer worth paying attention to. Needing nothing from anyone can look like strength from a distance, especially to someone who grew up watching that same behavior modeled as normal. Dr. Wong's response to that admiration points out something easy to miss in real life as well. Not needing anything from anyone is not automatically a healthy trait. Sometimes it simply means someone has gotten very good at avoiding the kind of closeness or vulnerability that actually requires depending on another person, even briefly, even in a small way. Rick's refusal to need anyone is not framed by Dr. Wong as freedom. It is framed as a wall built specifically to keep real connection and real reflection as far away as possible. Pickle Rick uses one of the most extreme, over-the-top premises in the entire show, a man turning himself into a pickle and fighting through a sewer, to make a point that has nothing to do with vegetables or action movie parody once it gets stripped down to its core. Avoiding a hard conversation does not make the reason for that conversation go away. It usually just adds a longer, more chaotic detour before that same conversation eventually has to happen anyway, sometimes in a form far more difficult than the one being avoided in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next episode on this list moves away from therapy offices and sewer chases entirely, shifting instead toward a quiet living room and a strange piece of technology that lets an entire family look directly into different versions of the lives they could have lived, and what happens once some of them start liking those other lives better than their own. Section 6. Ricksty Minutes. Ricksty Minutes is the 8th episode of the first season of Rick and Morty. It aired on March 17, 2014, was written by Tom Kaufman and Justin Roiland, and was directed by Brian Newton. It brought in close to 1.5 million viewers on its first airing. Reviewers at the time pointed out that this episode barely has a real plot compared to earlier stories about mutations or dangerous adventures. Instead, it spends almost its entire runtime sitting in one living room, watching a family compare their real lives to a set of imagined better ones. That simple setup ends up producing one of the most emotionally direct episodes the first season ever produced. A better-looking life on the outside is not automatically a better life to actually live, and chasing that imagined version can put the real one in serious danger. The episode begins with the Smith family sitting together watching regular television, specifically a dating show similar to The Bachelor. Rick, annoyed by how weak and predictable ordinary Earth television is compared to what exists elsewhere in the universe, decides to upgrade the family's cable box himself. His fix allows the television to pull in programming from an unlimited number of other realities, meaning the family can now flip through channels showing shows and broadcasts from countless different versions of existence, each one stranger than the last. What starts as a way to escape boring reality television quickly turns into something with far heavier consequences once the channel surfing accidentally lands on something personal. While flipping through these countless alternate channels, Jerry spots a version of himself appearing as a guest on a late-night talk show hosted by David Letterman. This alternate Jerry looks completely different from the Jerry sitting on the couch. He comes across as confident, successful, and admired, treated by the host and audience as someone worth celebrating rather than someone easy to overlook. Real Jerry becomes fixated almost instantly, desperate to learn more about how different his life could have turned out under slightly different circumstances. Rick explains that every person technically has a version of themselves living out a different life in a different reality, and he offers Jerry, Beth, and Summer a device built specifically to let a person see and experience life directly through the eyes of one of their alternate selves. Rick himself shows no interest in trying this device out on his own alternate self, choosing instead to stay on the couch with Morty, flipping through the wilder, more absurd channels the new cable setup has unlocked. This choice says something about Rick's character without needing much explanation. Someone who already understands how many nearly identical versions of himself exist across the multiverse has very little curiosity left about what any one particular version might be doing differently. Jerry, Beth, and Summer take Rick up on the offer and put the device on together, and the version of reality they land on turns out to be a sharp contrast to their actual lives. In this alternate reality, Jerry became a genuinely successful actor, living a life full of fame, parties, and reckless indulgence, including scenes involving drug use alongside real-world celebrities like Johnny Depp. Beth, in this same alternate reality, became the kind of surgeon she always wanted to be, operating on actual human patients rather than working as a veterinarian treating horses, which is her job in the reality the family actually lives in. On the surface, both parents appear to have gotten everything they once dreamed about, simply by living out a version of their lives that unfolded slightly differently. The difference between these two versions of Jerry and Beth's lives comes down to one specific detail. In the alternate reality they are viewing, Beth had gone through with an abortion instead of having Summer. Without a child pulling their time, money, and attention away from their own goals, both Jerry and Beth were free to chase the exact futures they wanted for themselves. Summer, watching all of this unfold alongside her parents, quickly realizes that nearly every alternate version of reality she checks shows the same basic pattern repeating. Her parents tend to do significantly better in almost every reality where she was never born at all. This realization leads directly into one of the more painful conversations the show had produced up to that point. Jerry and Beth, caught up in the emotional weight of everything they just witnessed, admit to Summer that she was an unplanned pregnancy, something that happened as a result of Jerry and Beth being together, unprotected, back on their high school prom night. They tell her plainly that her arrival in their lives is part of what kept them from reaching the goals they had once hoped for themselves. It is an honest answer, but a devastating one for a teenager to hear directly from both of her parents at once, confirming something she has probably wondered about in some form long before this exact conversation ever happened. Summer's reaction is immediate and understandable. She feels unwanted, and rather than sit with that feeling inside the house where it just got confirmed out loud, she decides she is done living there at all. She begins packing a bag, telling her parents she plans to leave and start some kind of new life for herself somewhere else, mentioning vague plans about moving toward the Southwest and figuring out something to do with turquoise, a plan that sounds more like a desperate reaction than an actual thought-out decision. Jerry and Beth, still shaken by what they just saw about their own alternate lives, do not stop her right away. If anything, watching those other versions of themselves succeeding without a child leaves them wondering out loud whether they themselves might be better off spending time apart, adding even more instability to a night that has already fallen apart quickly. It is Morty, not either parent, who ends up being the one to talk Summer down from actually leaving. He follows her upstairs while she packs and tries to comfort her, and when she pushes him away, assuming he is going to offer some simple, shallow comfort, he instead tells her something far heavier. He brings her to the window and points to a spot in the backyard, the same location where he and Rick had buried the bodies of their dead alternate selves back in the events covered earlier in Rick Potion number 9. Morty explains to Summer that the version of him she grew up with, along with the version of Rick tied to this exact reality, are both already dead, buried right outside the house. He tells her that he is not technically her original brother at all, but a version of her brother pulled in from a different reality entirely, one where the original Morty and Rick had died in an unrelated accident before he and his own Rick ever arrived to quietly take their place. Rather than treat this revelation as something meant to horrify Summer, Morty uses it to make a much larger point about existence in general. He tells her plainly that nobody exists on purpose, nobody truly belongs anywhere in particular, and everybody eventually dies no matter what path their life happens to take. After laying all of that out, he simply asks her to come back downstairs and watch television with the rest of them instead of running off into an uncertain, unplanned future by herself. Summer, hearing this blunt but strangely steady view of existence, decides to stay. The two of them head back downstairs together to rejoin Rick in front of the television, treating the moment with far less panic than the earlier conversation with their parents. Morty's speech captures something important about how this specific episode handles a genuinely difficult topic. He does not try to comfort Summer by insisting she was secretly wanted all along, or by pretending the earlier conversation with her parents did not happen the way it happened. Instead, he leans fully into the idea that existence itself is essentially random for everyone, not just for Summer specifically. If nobody exists for any deeper reason, then Summer not being part of some careful, intentional plan puts her in the exact same position as literally everyone else alive, rather than singling her out as uniquely unwanted. That framing does not erase the pain of what her parents told her, but it does stop that pain from being about her specifically being some kind of unique mistake, spreading the same basic randomness across every single person who has ever been born into any version of any reality. While Summer and Morty work through this heavier conversation upstairs, Jerry and Beth's storyline resolves in a very different way downstairs. Still connected to their alternate reality selves through the same viewing device, they end up witnessing something unexpected. Alternate Jerry and alternate Beth, despite having achieved everything real Jerry and real Beth have spent years wishing they had, end up reconnecting with each other in that other reality, drawn back together despite their separate paths toward fame and success. Watching this unfold convinces real Jerry and real Beth that maybe their pull toward each other runs deeper than just convenience or teenage circumstance. If two more successful, more independent versions of themselves still found their way back to each other anyway, that suggests something real might exist between them beyond the unplanned pregnancy that first brought them together all those years earlier. By the time the episode wraps up, nothing about the family's actual circumstances has physically changed. Jerry is still a veterinarian rather than a famous actor. Beth still operates on horses instead of people. Summer is still living in the same house, having decided to stay rather than run off towards some vague plan built entirely around turquoise and a change of scenery. What has shifted is something quieter and harder to see from the outside. The family briefly got to look directly at a version of their lives free of every complication currently weighing them down. And rather than that glimpse making their real lives feel worse by comparison, it ended up reinforcing something they might not have fully appreciated before checking those other channels. The connections they already had, messy and imperfect as they were, still meant something real, even next to a flashier version of success sitting right there in front of them. This idea carries real weight outside of science fiction and interdimensional cable boxes. It is easy to imagine an alternate version of a life built around fewer obligations, fewer complications, and fewer people depending on someone's time and attention. That imagined life can look appealing specifically because it gets to skip past every hard, tiring, complicated part of the actual life someone is currently living. Rixty Minutes points out something worth noticing about that kind of comparison. An imagined life only ever shows the parts that look good from a distance. It rarely accounts for what might genuinely be missing from that other version, the same way alternate Jerry and alternate Beth, despite having fame and career success neither of them ever achieved in the real timeline, still ended up finding their way back toward the same connection that real Jerry and real Beth already had all along. Summer's reaction throughout this episode also says something worth paying attention to. Discovering that her existence disrupted her parents' original plans hit her hard, exactly the way that kind of information would hit almost anyone hearing it for the first time. Her first instinct was to run from that pain entirely, packing a bag and planning to disappear into a life built on nothing more solid than a rough idea about turquoise and a change of location. What actually stopped her was not a promise that everything was fine or a denial of what her parents had just told her. It was a much bigger, blunter perspective from Morty, one that placed her specific pain inside a much wider pattern that applies to every person alive, whether their own arrival disrupted somebody's plans or not. Rick's Minutes never tries to argue that Jerry and Beth's alternate lives were somehow fake or less meaningful than their real ones. Both versions clearly happened, at least according to the internal logic of the show's multiverse. What the episode argues instead is that comparing a real, lived-in life against a highlight reel version of a different life will almost always make the real one look worse, purely because a highlight reel never has to show its own hidden costs and its own hidden problems. Alternate Jerry had fame and access to a lifestyle most people would envy from a distance, yet that same alternate Jerry still ended up back with the same partner real Jerry has right now, suggesting that whatever alternate Jerry gained in career success, he still found himself missing something that pulled him back toward exactly the same relationship sitting right in front of real Jerry the entire time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves entirely away from questions about identity or comparison and shifts into a very different kind of consequence, one built around a small device that promises an easy way to erase mistakes completely, and what actually happens once that promise gets tested against real choices that were never meant to be undone. Section 7. The Vat of Acid. Episode, The Vat of Acid. Episode is the 8th episode of the 4th season of Rick and Morty. It was written by Jeff Loveness and Albro Lundy, directed by Jacob Hare, and it aired on May 17, 2020. The episode later won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, and critics praised it for combining a strange, self-aware premise with a surprising amount of emotional depth. On the surface, it looks like another one of Rick's ridiculous schemes gone sideways, this time involving a literal vat of acid. Once the full story unfolds, it turns into one of the clearest arguments the show has ever made about why consequences matter. A life with no lasting consequences is not actually freedom. It is a life with nothing solid enough to build real meaning on top of. The episode opens with Rick and Morty meeting a group of alien gangsters at a factory to trade some valuable crystals. The deal turns out to be a setup. The gangsters betray them during the exchange, and Rick, thinking quickly, fakes both his own death and Morty's by jumping into a large vat that he claims is filled with acid, timed so it looks like they dissolved on contact. The plan almost works perfectly. The problem is that the gangsters do not immediately walk away afterward the way Rick expected. Instead, they linger near the vat, talking through their feelings about what just happened, reflecting out loud on the fact that a grandfather appeared to have taken his own grandson down with him in an act of shared suicide. Rick and Morty are stuck hiding at the bottom of the fake acid, forced to sit in silence and wait while the gangsters process their own emotions above them instead of simply leaving the scene. Morty, growing impatient with how long this is taking, eventually gives up on waiting quietly. He rises out of the vat, revealing that neither of them actually died, and the two of them end up having to kill the gangsters after the ruse falls apart earlier than planned. Once the immediate danger passes, Morty turns his frustration toward Rick directly, criticizing the entire vat of acid plan as a bad idea from the start. He points out that Rick never actually takes his own ideas seriously enough to think through how they might go wrong, essentially accusing Rick of constantly inventing risky solutions without ever properly testing whether those solutions could actually work under real pressure. This complaint from Morty ends up pushing Rick into building something new. Frustrated by Morty's criticism and maybe looking to prove a point, Rick agrees to build Morty a device that works something like a save feature in a video game. The idea is simple on the surface. Whenever Morty wants, he can mark a specific point in his life as a saved checkpoint using this small remote. If anything goes wrong afterward, anything at all, he can press a button and instantly return to that exact saved moment, as if none of what happened in between ever actually took place. Rick hands the device over to Morty without walking him through the details of exactly how it works, and Morty, eager to finally have something that lets him escape consequences the same way Rick often seems to, takes the remote without waiting around for a full explanation. Morty starts using the device almost immediately, treating it as a tool for consequence-free behavior. He commits a string of small crimes and pranks, resetting himself back to his saved point anytime something goes wrong or gets him into trouble. Since every mistake can apparently just be erased with a single press of a button, Morty stops worrying about outcomes altogether, testing the limits of what he can get away with now that failure no longer seems to carry any real weight. At some point during this stretch of consequence-free behavior, Morty saves a checkpoint right before approaching a girl walking into a coffee shop. He strikes up a conversation with her, and what starts as a casual, low-stakes interaction slowly grows into an actual relationship. The show depicts this relationship unfolding across a full year, condensed into a short musical sequence that shows Morty and this unnamed girl falling in love, going through the normal ups and downs any real couple experiences, and building something that genuinely seems to matter to both of them. For the first time in the episode, Morty appears to be using his second chances not to escape consequences, but simply to live an ordinary, meaningful life alongside someone he cares about. That relationship eventually gets tested in a serious way when Morty and his girlfriend end up stranded together after a plane crash, stuck in freezing conditions with no immediate way to reach safety. The situation becomes genuinely desperate. Cut off from rescue and running low on options, the two of them are forced to resort to eating parts of other passengers who did not survive the crash simply to stay alive long enough to be found. Even with the save device still available to him, Morty makes the deliberate choice not to use it. Reversing everything now would mean returning to the moment right before he ever met this girl. And by this point, staying with her and facing whatever danger comes next matters more to him than escaping the danger by pretending none of it ever happened. He chooses to call for rescue instead of resetting, holding on to the relationship rather than erasing the hardship that came along with it. Rescue eventually arrives, and Morty and his girlfriend survive the ordeal together, coming out the other side of a genuinely traumatic experience, still committed to each other. Just as things finally seem like they might settle into something stable and happy, Jerry, completely unaware of what the device actually does or how important that particular saved point is, accidentally activates the remote himself. Morty gets pulled straight back to the moment before he ever approached the girl in that coffee shop, erasing the entire relationship, the crash, the survival, and everything they built together across that full year, all in one accidental instant that Morty never chose and never saw coming. Morty tries to recreate the same relationship from scratch once he understands what happened, hoping he can simply walk up to the same girl again and rebuild everything he just lost. That attempt fails completely. Without the same shared history behind it, the second attempt at approaching her comes across as awkward and forced rather than natural, and in his frustration, Morty accidentally overwrites his own saved checkpoint entirely, permanently losing any ability to return to that specific moment ever again. Whatever chance existed to somehow recover what Jerry's accident erased disappears along with it, leaving Morty with nothing left of a relationship that, as far as he can now prove, essentially never happened at all. Devastated and finally out of easy options, Morty goes back to Rick and admits something important. He tells Rick that he has learned a real lesson from everything that just happened, one directly connected to Rick's earlier warning that this kind of consequence-free living was never actually a good idea to begin with. Morty explains that a life without consequences is not actually a better life. Consequences are what shape who a person becomes over time, and without them, choices stop carrying any real weight or meaning at all. Losing the relationship permanently, in a way that could never be undone or rebuilt through another reset, taught Morty something that simply living with unlimited second chances never could. Right after Morty admits this, Rick reveals something that completely reframes everything Morty has just been through. The device Rick built never actually worked as a time travel tool or a true reset button the way Morty assumed it did the entire time. Rick openly states that he has never believed in true time travel and never built anything designed to actually reverse events that already happened. Instead, every time Morty pressed that button, he was not resetting his own timeline at all. He was being teleported into a different, nearly identical alternate dimension, one where a different version of Morty already existed living out a similar life. Each reset required that alternate Morty to die so that the Morty holding the remote could take his place seamlessly, continuing on as if nothing unusual had occurred. This means every single reckless crime, every reset, and every consequence-free action Morty believed he was undoing painlessly actually came at the cost of an entirely separate version of himself dying somewhere else across the multiverse, each and every single time he pressed that button. What felt like a harmless video game-style reset to Morty was, in reality, a repeated pattern of an innocent version of him being killed off just so the Morty currently using the device could avoid facing whatever mess he had just caused. Morty, Horrified once he fully understands the true cost behind every reset he has already used, begs Rick to somehow fix what he has done. Rick offers a solution, though it is far from a clean or painless one. He merges every one of these alternate dimensions together into a single combined reality. This process undoes the individual deaths of each alternate Morty, since their separate timelines are no longer split apart the way they were before. The trade-off is significant. Everyone across this newly combined reality now remembers every crime, every reckless action, and every consequence Morty spent the entire episode avoiding, since all of those separate versions of events are now folded together into one shared memory shared by an entire population. An angry mob, made up of various victims, authorities, and other affected parties, quickly gathers outside the Smith family home, demanding that Morty answer for everything he did across every version of events that have now become part of one unified timeline. With no clean way out remaining, Rick offers Morty one final option, tying the entire episode back to its opening scene. He suggests faking Morty's death using the exact same vat of acid trick that Morty had mocked and criticized at the very start of the episode. Morty, having run out of any better alternative, reluctantly agrees, forced to accept the very idea he had dismissed as poorly thought through earlier, now serving as his only remaining escape from a crowd demanding accountability for everything he chose to avoid facing along the way. The full arc of this episode lands on a point that feels much heavier than the strange premise might initially suggest. Morty spent most of the episode believing he had found a genuine shortcut around consequences entirely, a way to act however he wanted without any lasting cost attached to those actions. That belief turned out to be false in two separate ways at once. On one level, Morty eventually learned through personal loss that even without knowing the hidden mechanics behind the device, losing something he actually cared about, permanently and without any way to recover it, taught him that consequences give weight and meaning to choices in a way that endless second chances never could. On a deeper level, once Rick revealed the truth about how the device actually worked, it became clear that consequences had been happening the entire time, regardless of whether Morty ever noticed them. He simply was not the one paying the price for his own actions. A separate, innocent version of himself was quietly dying every single time, somewhere else, completely unaware that his own existence was about to be erased, just so another version of the same person could keep living without having to answer for anything. This double-layered reveal makes the episode's central lesson land with more force than a simpler story might have managed. Believing a consequence has been avoided does not always mean it has actually disappeared. Sometimes it simply means someone else is quietly absorbing the cost instead, whether that cost gets noticed right away or not. Morty assumed his reckless behavior throughout the episode was harmless, purely because nothing bad seemed to be happening to him directly. The truth, once revealed, showed that real harm had been happening constantly, just displaced onto other versions of himself who never agreed to take on that burden and never even got the chance to understand why their lives were suddenly ending. There is also something worth noticing in how differently Morty treated his own two major uses of the device throughout the episode. When he used it for pranks and petty crimes, resetting mistakes felt like nothing more than a fun new ability with no real downside attached. The moment the device touched something that actually mattered to him, a real relationship built slowly over an entire year, the idea of resetting it stopped feeling appealing at all. Even before learning the full truth about how the remote actually worked, Morty instinctively understood that erasing a meaningful connection was a fundamentally different kind of loss compared to erasing a bad prank or a botched crime. That instinct, choosing to call for rescue rather than reset during the plane crash, already pointed toward the same lesson Rick's later explanation confirmed in a much darker and more literal way. The Vat of Acid episode uses a strange, almost silly premise, a literal vat of acid and a remote control borrowed from video game logic, to build toward a conclusion that has very little to do with either of those things by the time the credits roll. Choices carry weight because they cannot simply be undone without some kind of real cost attached somewhere. Removing that weight entirely does not create freedom. It just hides the cost somewhere else, out of view, until the moment it finally becomes impossible to ignore any longer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The episode after this one shifts away from questions about consequences and second chances entirely, moving instead toward a very different kind of struggle, one built around confronting the exact traits a person might most want to get rid of about themselves, and discovering what actually happens once those unwanted traits get pulled out and forced to exist on their own. Section 8. Rest and Relaxation. Rest and Relaxation is the 6th episode of the 3rd season of Rick and Morty. It aired on August 27, 2017, was written by Tom Kaufman, and was directed by Wesley Archer and Anthony Chun. On the surface, this episode looks like a simple spa day gone wrong, the kind of premise that sounds almost lighthearted compared to some of the show's darker storylines. Once the full plot unfolds, it becomes one of the clearest examples the show has ever offered of a much harder truth. The parts of a person that feel shameful, weak, or unpleasant are not separate from who that person actually is. They are part of the same whole, and trying to cut them away completely does not create a better version of someone. It just creates two broken halves instead of one complete person. The episode opens with Rick picking Morty up from school for what Rick promises will be a short 20-minute adventure. That promise falls apart almost immediately. The trip stretches on for 6 days instead, pushing both of them through one dangerous situation after another. By the time they finally make it back toward their ship, Rick and Morty are in worse physical and mental shape than viewers have seen them in before. Despite technically succeeding at whatever mission they were on, possibly even earning some kind of recognition for saving an entire population along the way, the toll of constantly fighting to survive finally catches up with both of them at once. Sitting inside the ship, the two of them break down completely, crying and yelling in a way that feels genuinely raw, rather than played purely for comedy. Rick, who almost never admits weakness of any kind, decides on the spot that they need a real vacation, something neither of them typically makes time for, given how constantly they are thrown into one crisis after another. Rick takes Morty to what he describes as the best spa in the entire universe. Since this is an alien resort, the experience does not resemble anything close to a normal spa day on Earth. At one point, Rick and Morty are shown being regurgitated out of the mouth of a large blob creature, a treatment apparently designed to relax whatever body passes through it. The strange, alien nature of the spa fits the show's usual style, treating something meant to feel soothing as something that would look horrifying to an outside observer. Eventually, Rick agrees to try the final and most intense treatment available, a machine specifically built to completely remove a person's toxins, framed as the ultimate way to relax by stripping away every negative or stressful part of a person's inner self. The treatment appears to go wrong almost immediately. Rick and Morty suddenly find themselves standing in a disgusting, toxic wasteland filled with strange, gooey monsters, assuming at first that the machine must have malfunctioned and possibly destroyed the entire spa around them. The truth turns out to be far stranger than a simple malfunction. Rick eventually realizes that he and Morty are not actually the real Rick and Morty at all. They are the toxic versions of themselves, the exact parts of their personalities that the machine was designed to pull out and separate from the rest of who they are. The real, purified Rick and Morty have already left the spa and are heading home, completely unaware that a separated version of their own worst traits has just been left behind in this wasteland, alongside similar toxic pieces pulled out of countless other spa guests. Toxic Rick is described as the rude, dishonest, alcoholic, and arrogant part of Rick's personality, carrying an inflated sense of his own importance without any of the more redeeming qualities that usually balance out his sharper edges. Toxic Morty, by contrast, is described as the nervous, desperate, and deeply self-loathing part of Morty, someone consumed by insecurity and self-doubt in a way that goes beyond ordinary teenage anxiety. Both of these toxic versions are now trapped together in this wasteland, cut off from the rest of the world, forced to figure out how to survive without any of the traits that had been separated out and sent home in the cleaner, purified versions of Rick and Morty walking around on Earth. Back home, the purified Rick and Morty return, looking noticeably different. Rick appears calmer, more polite, and even physically healthier, having lost the grayish, worn-out complexion that usually comes from years of heavy drinking. Morty, freed from the insecurity and self-doubt that normally follow him everywhere, suddenly finds himself confident, kind, and unexpectedly popular at school. He openly insults a teacher named Mr. Goldenfold in class, something the old Morty would never have had the nerve to do. And rather than getting in trouble for it, he actually earns respect from his classmates for standing up so boldly. His newfound confidence catches the attention of Jessica, the same classmate Morty has had feelings for throughout earlier seasons. For the first time, Morty works up the nerve to ask her out directly, and she happily agrees. While Purified Morty enjoys this sudden burst of popularity and confidence, Purified Rick receives a disturbing transmission on his phone, one carrying the voices of Toxic Rick and Toxic Morty, still trapped and clearly suffering inside the wasteland they were left behind in. Rick quickly puts together what actually happened during the spa treatment, realizing that toxic versions of himself and Morty are sentient, aware of their own situation, and sharing the same intelligence Rick relies on constantly. Purified Morty, unwilling to risk losing the confidence and social success he has only just discovered, destroys Rick's phone rather than deal with the situation, telling Rick to simply enjoy this new version of themselves instead of worrying about the toxic halves left behind somewhere else entirely. This choice to ignore the problem does not make it disappear. Meanwhile, Purified Morty's date with Jessica quickly turns into a disaster. Without the insecurity that once made him cautious and self-aware, Morty's newfound confidence tips over into something closer to arrogance, coming across as overconfident and lacking any real empathy or self-awareness during the date itself. Jessica does not respond well to this new version of him, and the date falls apart. Rather than reflecting on what went wrong, Morty simply moves on to another girl named Stacy, treating the failed date with Jessica as barely worth a second thought. Eventually, Morty brings Stacy back to the house, and it is here that the consequences of ignoring Toxic Rick's earlier message finally catch up with him. He discovers that Rick has been continuing to receive transmissions from the toxic wasteland, and that Rick appears to be actively preparing a plan to merge himself and Morty back together with their toxic counterparts. Morty grows suspicious of this plan almost immediately, wondering whether Toxic Rick might be lying about the entire situation to trick his way out of the wasteland under false pretenses. He enlists Stacy's help to get away before the merger can happen, choosing to trust his suspicion over Rick's plan. That suspicion turns out to be correct. Toxic Rick was never actually planning an honest merger between the two separated halves. His real plan was to trick his way back into the world and simply take the place of the real, Purified Rick, abandoning any real intention of rejoining with the parts of himself that had been left behind. Once this plan is exposed, Purified Rick and Toxic Rick end up in a direct physical fight, evenly matched against each other since they share the exact same intelligence and instincts, just filtered through very different personalities. Realizing that overpowering Rick directly is not working, Toxic Rick shifts strategy entirely. Rather than continuing to fight for a way back into the real world himself, he decides it would be far easier to simply make the entire world toxic instead, eliminating the need to escape the wasteland at all, if the wasteland's version of existence can just be spread everywhere else. He activates a device capable of releasing what gets described as a world-wrecking wave, a toxic beam that spreads across the entire population, pulling out and amplifying whatever traits each affected person hates most about themselves. The same way the spa machine had done specifically to Rick and Morty earlier in the episode. The effects of this wave turn genuinely disturbing almost immediately. In one especially unsettling detail, a group of children attending a birthday party get caught in the beam and transform into violent, murderous versions of themselves, acting out whatever dark impulses had been buried beneath their usual behavior. This detail matters because it shows the toxicity wave is not simply an exaggerated cartoon effect limited to background chaos. It carries real, lasting consequences for anyone caught inside it. Consequences that do not simply disappear once the immediate danger passes. The final confrontation of the episode takes place at a moonlight tower, where Purified Rick finally catches up to both Toxic Rick and Toxic Morty. In a calculated and fairly ruthless move, Rick shoots Toxic Morty, understanding that Toxic Rick, despite everything selfish and dishonest about his character, still holds the same underlying affection for his own version of Morty that the real Rick holds for the real Morty. Faced with the possibility of losing Toxic Morty permanently, Toxic Rick finally agrees to the merger he had been actively avoiding throughout the entire episode. The moment the two Ricks and the two Mortys rejoin into their original, complete forms, the toxic wave spreading across the world reverses immediately, restoring the planet back to something resembling normal. This reversal does not undo everything that happened while people were affected by the wave, though. The episode makes a point of showing survivors left disoriented, traumatized, and surrounded by blood and damage caused by actions taken while the toxicity was active. Undoing the source of a problem does not automatically erase every consequence that problem already caused while it was active. Even after this reunion technically restores Rick to his complete, whole self, Morty resists the same outcome. Still unwilling to take back the insecurity, anxiety, and self-doubt that once defined so much of his personality, he flees rather than allow the merger to include him as well. 3 weeks pass, and the episode reveals that this incomplete, purified version of Morty has relocated to New York, where he has become a highly successful stockbroker, thriving in a fast-paced, competitive environment without any of the guilt or hesitation that used to hold him back. He appears to be in a new relationship as well, seemingly living exactly the kind of confident, unburdened life he always wished he could access. That success does not last. Jessica eventually calls him, asking him to come back, and Rick, suspecting exactly what is happening, works to trace the call back to Morty's location while the conversation continues. Morty, despite his suspicion that Rick might be doing exactly this, keeps the call going anyway, long enough for Rick to successfully track him down. Rick eventually finds him, and refusing to leave things unfinished, forces the two halves of Morty back together, restoring him to the same complete, imperfect version of himself that existed before any of this started. The lesson sitting underneath all of this chaos becomes clear once the wilder plot details settle. Removing the parts of a person that feel unpleasant, insecure, or shameful does not simply leave behind a better, cleaner version of that same person. It creates two separate, incomplete halves, one carrying all the confidence and none of the caution, and one carrying all the darker impulses without any of the traits that might normally keep those impulses in check. Purified Morty was more confident, but that confidence came without empathy, without self-awareness, and without the hesitation that had previously kept him from hurting people carelessly. Toxic Rick and Toxic Morty, meanwhile, were left with nothing but the traits everyone tends to be embarrassed by, stripped of the intelligence, humor, and even the affection that normally balance those traits out in the real, complete versions of themselves. This episode argues something that runs against a fairly common instinct people have about their own flaws. It can feel appealing to imagine cutting away the parts of a personality that cause the most trouble, the insecurity, the anger, the self-doubt, or the selfishness, and keeping only the parts that feel good or useful. Rest and relaxation suggests that this kind of clean separation does not actually work the way it sounds like it should. The uncomfortable parts of a person are tangled up with the same traits that make that person capable of caring about someone else, hesitating before causing harm, or recognizing when something has gone too far. Pulling those threads apart does not leave two better people behind. It leaves one person missing something essential and another person made up of nothing but the worst parts, with no remaining reason to hold back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section shifts away from personal flaws and internal struggle entirely, moving towards something built on a much larger scale, following what happens when an entire society built on hope and change ends up handing real power to someone whose true intentions were hidden the whole time. Section 9. The Ricklantis Mix-Up. The Ricklantis Mix-Up is the 7th episode of the 3rd season of Rick and Morty. It first aired in September of 2017. The title and the opening scene both suggest the episode is going to follow Rick and Morty on a self-contained adventure exploring the lost city of Atlantis. That setup turns out to be a deliberate misdirection. Once the actual episode begins, it barely spends any time with the main Rick and Morty at all, instead shifting its full attention toward the Citadel of Ricks, a massive city made up entirely of countless versions of Rick and Morty pulled from different realities across the multiverse. What plays out inside that city becomes one of the sharpest political stories the show has ever told, built around a simple but uncomfortable lesson. A system built on real unfairness can be taken over by someone offering hope, without that person ever needing to prove they actually deserve the power being handed to them. Some context helps explain how the Citadel reaches the state it is in by the start of this episode. Earlier in the season, in an episode called The Rickdemption, the original Rick from the main timeline destroyed the Citadel entirely as part of a larger plan to escape from Galactic Federation custody. That destruction left the Citadel in ruins, and by the time the Ricklantis Mix-Up picks up the story, the surviving Ricks and Mortys have already rebuilt it into a fully functioning city again. Rather than sticking around to help with that rebuilding effort, the main Rick chooses to head off toward an adventure in Atlantis instead, treating the Citadel and its problems as something that has nothing to do with him anymore. Inside the rebuilt Citadel, the episode reveals a structured society with its own internal government, economy, and, most importantly for this story, its own deep divide between different kinds of citizens. Every version of Rick tends to hold positions of higher status inside the Citadel, working as police officers, teachers, factory supervisors, and other roles that come with a measure of respect and authority. Every version of Morty, by contrast, tends to occupy lower status roles across the city, treated by many Ricks as second-class citizens rather than as equals. This divide sits at the center of nearly everything that unfolds over the course of the episode, showing how a society built around one type of person holding structural power over another type of person tends to create resentment, frustration, and, eventually, an opening for someone to exploit that resentment. The episode follows several separate storylines happening at once across different parts of the Citadel, each one showing a different corner of this unequal system. One storyline follows a newly trained police officer, a Rick, who has just finished the Citadel's police academy and gets partnered with a more experienced Morty officer. This particular Morty officer turns out to hold deeply negative views about Mortys in general, despite being a Morty himself, treating his own kind with the same dismissive attitude that many Ricks in the Citadel already hold. This detail adds an extra layer to the divide running through the entire city, showing that prejudice inside this system does not only flow from Ricks toward Mortys. It has become deeply enough embedded that even some Mortys have absorbed and started repeating the same attitudes. A second storyline follows a group of 4 young Mortys attending a school specifically designed to train Mortys for their expected role as disposable sidekicks to whichever Rick they eventually get assigned to. Rather than accept that fate, the group leaves school in search of something called the Wishing Portal, holding on to hope that finding it might offer them a way to escape the future the Citadel has already mapped out for someone in their position. A third storyline follows a Rick working inside a candy factory, producing a popular treat made using the neural secretions of a captive alien creature, quietly highlighting how even the more mundane parts of the Citadel's economy rest on some form of exploitation happening just out of sight. The storyline that ends up carrying the most weight throughout the episode centers on a presidential election taking place across the entire Citadel. With the previous ruling structure destroyed and rebuilt, the Citadel has moved toward electing a new leader through a democratic vote, a process the news coverage inside the episode treats with open amusement once it becomes clear that one of the leading candidates is a Morty. Nobody inside the Citadel takes this candidate especially seriously at first, since the entire structure of the city assumes that a Morty could never actually beat a Rick in a fair contest for power. This particular Morty, known throughout the episode simply as Candidate Morty, ends up winning over crowds during public debates by delivering a compelling speech about the real problems facing ordinary citizens across the Citadel and about the power that regular people, meaning the Mortys treated as second class throughout the entire system, could hold if they organized around a shared cause. His message resonates specifically with Mortys, who have spent their entire lives being treated as lesser than the Ricks around them, offering them something that sounds like genuine hope for real change after years of accepting their lower status as simply how things work. Candidate Morty fires his campaign manager, another Morty who had been working closely with him throughout the election, in a moment that seems abrupt and confusing at the time it happens. The fired campaign manager, described throughout the episode simply as Campaign Manager Morty, reacts with disbelief and frustration at being let go so suddenly after putting so much work into helping candidate Morty build his campaign from the ground up. Shortly after this firing, Campaign Manager Morty gets approached by a character called Investigator Rick, who hands him a set of secret files. These files apparently contain information revealing something important about candidate Morty's true identity, something significant enough that Campaign Manager Morty decides to act on it immediately. At candidate Morty's next public rally, still processing both his firing and whatever he just learned from those documents, Campaign Manager Morty confronts candidate Morty directly in front of the crowd and shoots him. Candidate Morty survives the assassination attempt. In the aftermath, it becomes clear that this survival, combined with the sympathy generated by having faced down an attempt on his life, helps push him over the edge into an actual election victory, winning the presidency of the Citadel by a narrow margin. Once in office, President Morty moves quickly and decisively, showing none of the hesitation or uncertainty that might be expected from an inexperienced political newcomer suddenly running an entire city. He begins having a number of politically powerful Ricks executed, including a specific council member named Rick D. Sanchez III, cementing his authority by removing anyone who might challenge him from a position of real influence inside the Citadel's existing power structure. The full weight of what has actually happened only becomes clear in the episode's final moments. The bodies of the executed council members, along with several other Ricks and Mortys who have died over the course of the episode, get shown being ejected out of an airlock into the vacuum of space, a method the Citadel apparently uses to dispose of its dead. Among these floating bodies is campaign manager Morty himself, and next to his body float the secret documents investigator Rick had handed him earlier. These documents reveal, in a moment carefully timed for maximum impact, that the newly elected President Morty is not simply an ordinary Morty who rose up through hope and public speaking alone. He is revealed to be the exact same character known throughout the show as Evil Morty, a mysterious and manipulative figure who had first appeared several seasons earlier, identified at that time as someone controlling a captured Rick from behind the scenes using a hidden cybernetic device. This reveal recontextualizes nearly everything that happened throughout the episode's election storyline. Candidate Morty's inspiring speeches about the power of ordinary Mortys, his firing of a loyal campaign manager just before that same manager could expose him, and his fast, ruthless consolidation of power once elected, all of it lines up with a much darker read once his true identity as Evil Morty becomes clear. He did not build a movement purely out of genuine belief in fixing the Citadel's unfair treatment of Mortis. He built a movement that happened to serve as an effective vehicle for gaining total control over a city filled with people desperate enough for change that they were willing to overlook how little they actually knew about the person promising to deliver it. The genuine unfairness running through the Citadel's structure throughout this episode is worth sitting with directly, separate from the twist involving Evil Morty. Every subplot shown across the episode, the corrupt police partnership, the factory worker resentful of Ricks living more comfortable lives nearby, the group of young Mortys desperate enough to abandon school in search of a mythical portal rather than accept their assigned future, all of it points toward a system that genuinely mistreats an entire category of its own citizens. That mistreatment is real, and the frustration building up underneath it throughout the episode is completely understandable given everything shown about how differently Ricks and Mortys are treated across nearly every corner of the Citadel. That real, legitimate frustration is exactly what made Evil Morty's rise to power possible in the first place. A population that has spent years being told they are naturally less capable, less deserving of respect, and less entitled to real influence over their own lives is far more likely to respond strongly to anyone who shows up promising to finally change that arrangement, regardless of how much actual proof exists behind those promises. Evil Morty did not need to prove his intentions were good before winning widespread support. He simply needed to say the right things to people who were already desperate enough to want to believe someone finally understood their situation. This pattern captures something that shows up far beyond any fictional city built entirely out of alternate versions of two characters from a cartoon. A group of people who have been genuinely mistreated by an existing system are naturally going to respond to anyone offering hope of real change, and that response makes complete sense given everything they have actually experienced. The danger sitting inside that same dynamic comes from how easily a movement built around real frustration can end up being led by someone whose true goals have nothing to do with fixing the underlying unfairness at all. Genuine grievances do not automatically produce trustworthy leadership just because someone claims to be speaking on behalf of the people holding those grievances. Campaign manager Morty's fate throughout the episode reinforces this same point from a slightly different angle. He worked closely alongside candidate Morty throughout the campaign, believing in the cause enough to dedicate real effort toward helping him win. Getting fired abruptly, right before uncovering proof of who he had actually been supporting the entire time, cost him everything, including his own life, once he tried to expose the truth in public. Being close to power, or even helping build that power directly, does not guarantee any real understanding of what that power is actually being used for underneath the surface. The episode's decision to hide its main political story behind a title suggesting a light-hearted Atlantis adventure adds one more layer worth noticing. Just as viewers were led to expect something completely different from what actually unfolded, the citizens of the Citadel were led to expect a genuine political outsider fighting for real change, only to discover, far too late for many of them, that the entire campaign had been built around someone with a very different agenda, hiding underneath a convincing message. Both the audience and the characters inside the story experience the same basic lesson from two different directions at once. What gets presented on the surface, whether that is an episode title or a campaign slogan, does not always match what is actually happening underneath it. By the end of the Ricklantis mix-up, The Citadel has a new leader who has already proven willing to execute anyone standing between himself and complete control, all while the population that voted for him remains largely unaware of who they actually elected. The unfair system that made his rise possible in the first place has not been fixed at all. It has simply changed hands, moving from a group of established Ricks holding power over Mortys toward a single Morty holding total power over everyone, achieved through manipulation rather than any real structural change to how the Citadel actually treats its most vulnerable citizens. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves entirely away from cities, politics, and inherited systems, shifting instead toward a much more personal question, one built around a strange set of crystals capable of showing a person every possible way their life might eventually end, and what that knowledge actually does to someone once they cannot stop thinking about it. Section 10. Edge of Morty. Rick Die. Rick Pete. Edge of Morty, Rick Die. Rick Pete is the first episode of the 4th season of Rick and Morty. It aired on November 10, 2019, was written by Mike McMahon, and was directed by Erica Hayes. The episode loosely adapts ideas from the Japanese manga Akira, created by Katsuhiro Otomo, blending that inspiration into the show's usual mix of science fiction and family conflict. It received strong reviews from critics at the time, praised for its high-concept premise and its heavy use of anime-style visuals. Underneath all of that stylistic ambition sits a lesson about something everyone eventually has to deal with in one way or another. Trying to lock in one single, certain version of the future and forcing every choice to bend toward that one outcome tends to cause far more damage than simply living with the uncertainty that the future naturally carries. The episode opens at breakfast, with Rick trying to pull Morty into another adventure the same way he always has, expecting Morty to simply go along with it without much say in the matter. This time, something has changed. New family rules, put in place following the tension and separation the Smith family went through during the 3rd season, now require Rick to actually ask Morty politely before dragging him into anything, rather than just assuming Morty will follow along automatically. Rick is clearly frustrated by having to ask permission for something he used to take for granted, but he follows the new rule anyway, and Morty agrees to come along once Rick actually asks him properly. The adventure this time takes them to a planet called Bajulon Prime, where Rick plans to harvest something called death crystals. These crystals show whoever is holding them every possible way their life could eventually end, based on the different choices they might make going forward. Rick explains that he uses these crystals specifically to identify every version of his own death and then actively avoid whatever choices lead toward those outcomes, essentially using the crystals as an early warning system to dodge danger before it ever becomes real. When Morty picks up a crystal of his own out of curiosity, he sees something completely different from what Rick usually looks for. Instead of scanning for danger to avoid, Morty catches a glimpse of one specific peaceful outcome, seeing himself living to old age, happily married to Jessica, the same classmate he has had feelings for throughout the entire show. Rather than treating this vision as just one possibility among countless others, Morty becomes fixated on making that exact peaceful ending come true. He starts trying to follow the path shown inside the crystal as closely as possible, treating it less like a general guide and more like a fixed set of instructions he needs to match perfectly. This decision sets off a chain of events that grows increasingly extreme as the episode continues, each new complication pushing Morty further away from the simple, peaceful life he originally saw and further into a situation defined entirely by trying to force one specific outcome into existence, no matter what stands in the way. Early into Morty's attempt to follow this path, disaster strikes almost immediately. Morty crashes a car during one of the steps he believes will lead him toward his desired future, and the crash ends up killing Rick. Rather than treating this as a clear sign that something has gone badly wrong with his plan, a hologram version of Rick suddenly appears, urging Morty to revive the real Rick through cloning. Morty refuses, reasoning that cloning Rick would send his own path down a completely different set of possible deaths than the one he originally saw and became fixated on. This refusal leads to Morty getting harassed by an entire crowd of these holoricks, each one apparently generated by different branching possibilities connected to the crystal's guidance, pressuring him from multiple directions at once about the choice he just made. Morty keeps pushing forward anyway, still trying to follow whatever path the crystal seems to be showing him toward that peaceful ending with Jessica. Along the way, he runs into a bully, and the encounter escalates into violence, ending with Morty killing him as part of continuing to follow the crystal's guidance. Rather than stopping at this point to reconsider what he is actually doing, Morty keeps moving forward down this same path, and the violence keeps escalating right alongside him. He ends up killing additional bullies, then finds himself facing down police officers, and eventually the situation grows large enough that he is confronting the military directly, all while still convinced that continuing to follow the crystal's guidance is somehow going to lead him back toward the same peaceful old age he originally glimpsed. Morty eventually surrenders and stands trial for everything he has done throughout this violent stretch of the episode. Rather than facing any real consequences for his actions, he manages to avoid punishment entirely by continuing to follow the guidance the crystal keeps offering him, using its predictions to sidestep whatever legal trouble might otherwise be waiting for him. By this point, the scale of what is happening has grown far beyond anything resembling a normal life. Morty eventually transforms into a massive, monstrous being sitting at the center of an enormous structure made of advanced nanotechnology. An image drawn directly from the climactic transformation scenes found in Akira, the same manga this episode openly draws its inspiration from. The real Rick, having been revived at some point after the earlier car crash, arrives alongside another version of himself known as Wasp Rick, to finally put a stop to what Morty has turned into. Together they manage to remove the crystal from Morty, cutting off whatever connection had been driving him deeper and deeper into this escalating chain of violence throughout the episode. Once the crystal is removed, the Hollow Rick who had been pushing Morty toward reviving Rick earlier in the episode makes a final move of his own, attempting to use the same nanotechnology surrounding Morty to become a physical being himself, and eventually attempting to elevate himself into something resembling a god. Wasp Rick ultimately kills him before that transformation can go any further, closing out the chaos that had been building since Morty's very first attempt to follow the crystal's guidance. Once the dust settles, Jerry and Beth confront Rick, blaming him for putting Morty in danger by giving him access to a death crystal in the first place. Morty steps in at this point and pushes back against that framing directly, insisting that everything that happened throughout the episode was his own doing, not something Rick forced onto him. Rick did not tell Morty to chase one specific version of his future so aggressively that he was willing to kill repeatedly just to protect that exact outcome. Morty made that choice entirely on his own the moment he decided one imagined version of his life mattered more than simply living and making decisions as they actually came. Rick's own explanation of how he uses the death crystals throughout the episode offers a clear contrast to how Morty ends up using the exact same tool. Rick treats the crystals as a way to stay alert to danger, using the different visions of his own death purely as information to avoid specific outcomes, never trying to lock in one single guaranteed future for himself. He explains to Morty that a person's future grows directly out of choices made in the present, and if someone keeps living and making decisions the way they should, that future should naturally keep shifting and changing over time rather than settling into one fixed, predictable outcome. Rick adds that anyone who becomes completely certain of exactly how their life is going to end is either living an extremely boring, uneventful existence or is already caught in some kind of serious danger close enough to guarantee that one specific outcome. Morty, rather than using this same information the way Rick does, tries to grab hold of one specific vision and force reality to match it exactly. And that decision is what actually causes the entire disaster unfolding around him for the rest of the episode. This contrast between Rick and Morty's approach carries a lesson that reaches far beyond crystals or predicted futures. Nobody actually gets to know for certain exactly how their life is going to turn out, no matter how badly they might want that kind of certainty. Chasing one single, specific version of the future and treating every choice along the way as something that must bend toward matching that one picture exactly tends to create far more damage than simply making reasonable decisions as situations actually unfold in real time. Morty was not punished throughout this episode for wanting a peaceful, happy life. He was undone by his refusal to accept that life as something he needed to live moment by moment, rather than something he could force into existence exactly as he first imagined it. Across every episode covered throughout this entire look at Rick and Morty, one thread keeps showing up in different forms. Quick fixes create bigger problems than the ones they were meant to solve. Losing an entire identity inside another person leaves nothing standing once that connection ends. Chasing an impossible goal without adjusting course multiplies suffering rather than resolving it. Real relationships are built on more than just comfortable memories. Avoiding hard emotional work does not make the underlying problem disappear. Comparing a real life against an imagined better one usually makes the real one look worse than it actually is. Consequences give weight and meaning to choices that would otherwise mean nothing at all. The parts of a person that feel shameful are still part of the same whole person. A movement built on real unfairness can still be led somewhere dangerous by someone whose true motives stay hidden, and trying to force one certain version of the future into existence tends to cause more harm than simply living with whatever comes next. None of these lessons needed a serious drama or a philosophy textbook to land. They showed up inside a cartoon built around a drunk scientist and his anxious grandson traveling through portals, fighting mutated bugs, and arguing over golf lessons gone wrong. That contrast is exactly what makes Rick and Morty worth paying attention to, well past its jokes and its chaos. Underneath the noise, it keeps finding honest, uncomfortable truths about what it actually means to live a full, complicated, unpredictable life. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.